kind of a bit of a little bit of background on my conversation with Brad and how this came about. We were at a mixer, and I was asking Brad if any of the members had been talking about the increase in fraud on business accounts. And like a lot of things these days, it's really been going up. And something that we see a lot, unfortunately, at the bank. And so I just thought it would be good to kind of just sound the alarm a little bit and let business owners and bookkeepers and people that are involved with business accounts to just be aware of what some of the more common fraud is out there. It's very disappointing and discouraging, but one of the things that seems likely is that over the last few years since COVID started, people were home, they had time on their hands, and unfortunately did some thinking about how they could make some easy money. And unfortunately, probably one of the ways that they came up with was by committing some fraud and taking other people's money. So we always hate to see that. We're very vigilant. I think I want to share some good news. I think if there is some good news about all this is I think on our side as a bank and as a banking industry, we've become much better about helping deter fraud and discover fraud. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways that we do that. But unfortunately, we see it come up way more than we did before COVID started. So with that kind of a little bit of an introduction, I'm going to go ahead and jump in and just thank you guys for joining us. I'm going to talk about really two different types of bank fraud. The first is check fraud. So what is check fraud? Check fraud basically is when someone negotiates or cashes a fraudulent check. And there's really kind of two different types of fraudulent checks. One is actually a legitimate check that is what they call washed, which where somebody takes a legitimate check that's maybe written out to one party and actually washes or removes the name of the payee. They can also alter the amount of the check, and having washed it, they can fill in whatever they want to and then try to either cash that or deposit it to get that. The other way is where they actually print fraudulent checks, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, how that's done in just a minute. But I talked about the increase in fraud. So just some statistics to start out. Last year, being 2022, there were 680,000 reported cases of check fraud and estimated losses of about $24 billion. The number of cases reported was almost double what it had been in 2021. And as you can imagine, 2021 was much higher than what it was before COVID. So it's really going up exponentially. So check fraud is much more common. We see it on a daily basis much more often than the second type that I'm going to talk about, which is corporate account takeover. But why check fraud? Well, check fraud is kind of a low-tech crime. It's really pretty easy to attempt. And so I talked about check washing. So what happens a lot of times is checks, actual real checks, are stolen out of mailboxes. Doesn't have to be. They could be, think about as a business, you send out checks for vendor payments. And one of those checks could get stolen by an employee of a vendor, or any number of different ways, and then washed. But your checks, as you know, have your account number written on the bottom. So down at the bottom, you've got your bank routing number, you've got your account number, and you've got the check number all encoded at the bottom of the check. So anybody really can see, anybody that that sees your check, knows what your account number is, know where your bank account is. They've got a lot of information right there. And really, they've got all the information that they need to be able to manufacture fraudulent checks. And with the internet, there's all kinds of ways to print checks. You don't need to go to your bank and get official bank issued checks anymore. You can go through any number of third parties. You can get on the internet and you can order checks. You just tell them what the bank routing number and what account number and where you want to start the check sequence, and you can get checks. You can even there's programs out there you can buy check stock. So printing a fraudulent check is not difficult at all to do. And honestly, we see fraudulent checks more often than we see the check washing. Another thing to note on those fraudulent checks, they don't always get those checks printed with the correct business name on there. So we've seen customers who have had fraudulent checks presented against their account and looked at the check, and the check has a completely different business name on it, but it's still got their routing information, their account number, and it will be presented for payment against that account. So we see that too. Social media, especially during COVID, there was a lot of sites out there that were basically teaching fraudsters how to do this. And so that's been part of the reason why we're seeing it happen more. And like I said, just the time on people's hands. We see a lot of these fraudulent checks actually being presented for cashing at our branches. So it's not unusual at all for us to get a call from someone who's got a check written on a local business. Typically, you see these fraudsters going to a bank branch in a different city. So for instance, we've got branches in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we'll get a call from a branch up in Fort Worth, and someone's there trying to cash a payroll check on XYZ company, and they've got fake identification, and so a lot of times these scammers hire people to go into the branches to try to cash these checks. Not always the one that's perpetuating the fraud is actually going into the branch trying to cash them. And more often than not, they do try to cash them as opposed to deposit them into an account, although that does happen as well. We talked about, I'm sorry, go ahead. Hello, we have a question? Okay, I'll keep going. We talked about check washing already, and kind of how they get your account information. So I wanted to try to give some tips on what can we do to try to reduce your risk of being a victim of check fraud. And I'll start out by saying that so we have a fraud detection software that analyzes these checks as they're being presented, and it kicks out a lot of fraudulent checks. It's actually really very good. And recently, we get a handful of images a day sent to us from our back office saying, could you check with the customer? This check looks suspicious. And some of the things I look for is the check number out of sequence. Is it a different check stock? Do the signatures look vastly different? So the banks are very keen to trying to help identify these and making sure that if we see something that looks suspicious, we're asking the customer to please verify this is a legitimate check. But checks in general, by their nature, you think about, how many checks a month you write. Think about how many different people have access to that check and can snap a picture of it, can get your account information off of an actual physical check. It's not the most safe way to to make payments anymore, honestly, just because of the fact that checks can be printed, can be washed, and your information is out there to a lot of people to be able to see. So there's a wide variety of different ways to do electronic payments without the use of paper checks. In general, paper checks have been dramatically reducing in number, so people don't use checks nearly as much as they used to. They're using electronic payments a lot more than what we used to. But nevertheless, the fraud is still increasing. But a business, even a small business, can consider doing payroll, doing vendor payments, really paying any bills that you have electronically. And so the most common way that we see that those electronic payments working is through the ACH network. So ACH payments, you see this probably most frequently with payroll. For those of you that are familiar with direct deposit of payroll, that's actually an ACH payment. And so the way that works, sometimes that goes through a third-party payroll service that initiates that on behalf of their customer, where they basically just collect that payroll amount from the customer and then they disperse it to the employees. Or sometimes the employees or the employer creates an ACH file, which is an electronic file. The bank provides a payment platform that you log into. You enter in the employee's name, their bank account number, the routing number, just same information you would need to send a wire transfer. And then that file is uploaded securely to the bank. And then the bank, through the ACH network, disperses those payments directly to either the employee or, in the case of vendor payments. And that settlement normally happens the next day. So if you're trying to get a payment sent out and you send it on a Thursday, that should be posted and received by the employee or the vendor the next day. So it's a very secure way to send money electronically. It's fast. And so in order to do that, you just contact your vendors or your employees and say, hey, we're looking at sending payments electronically now. We need to get your account information. And once it's set up, it's really easy just to, especially for recurring payments, if you got a vendor that you pay every month, you input that vendor one time and then you just put the amount in every time you want to send and send that ACH file. Banks also have a service called Positive Pay, and Positive Pay is a service that's I think most every bank now provides it, and sometimes banks use different terminology, but I think Positive Pay is a product that most banks call Positive Pay. I've only worked for a couple of banks, but we always use the same terminology. And as I've talked to my fellow bankers, they tend to all use that Positive Pay name. So what is Positive Pay? Basically, you're telling the bank as you issue checks what legitimate checks you're issuing. And again, that communication happens electronically. So the bank provides you a cash management platform. You go in and either upload your check register off of your bookkeeping software, or if you want, you can go in there and manually input, okay, on this date, I issued a $500 check to XYZ Contracting Company, and it's check number 1307. And you send that file electronically, and then the bank compares that file with the checks as they're coming in, and then spits out any exceptions. So if a check is trying to clear against your account and you haven't told the bank that you issued that check, that will spit out as an exception. And then you'll either get a message, or typically our customers log in every day and they look for exceptions. And sometimes the exceptions are legitimate checks that they forgot to input. It could also be an electronic debit, but they have an opportunity to review anything that wasn't specifically authorized through their Positive Pay network. And so that's a really, really good way, probably the best way to keep unauthorized checks or other withdrawals from coming out of your account. So I really do encourage businesses to take advantage of that. It's a great service. Typically, there is a cost associated with setting up Positive Pay, but most banks offer the opportunity to offset those charges with account balances, and everybody normally keeps a positive balance. So the bank benefits from that, and they use that benefit to offset fees like Positive Pay. So I would encourage businesses to talk to their banker about, what do I need to do to get it set up on Positive Pay? Because it really is probably the best defense against check fraud. Also, just be careful about mailing things. So putting something in an insecure mailbox for the postman to come by and pick up, it can be an easy.
Is that? Yeah. That bitch, we like fast food. We like niggas that sell drugs with fast food. Sell fast food. Niggas come ride a car.
Would you mind muting your? Would you mind putting yourself on mute? We're hearing some feedback. Is that?
I'm Pepitino. I'm Pepitino.
Would you please mute your microphone? There you go. Okay. So just be cautious about outgoing mail. You know, somebody can come in and take that out of your mailbox pretty easily. So if you've got somebody out making deliveries, or if you want to stop by the post office on your way home, or at least put it into a secure mailbox, that's going to be a little bit more safe than just putting it in a outgoing mailbox. Another thing that's really important for any type of fraud, and this could even extend to, you know, things like embezzlement, internal fraud. But if you're a business owner, it's really important to review your bank statements each month. And unfortunately, it's important for you to do that, as opposed to delegating that off to a
You're unmuted again, Ampe.
There we go. All right. Let's see. I think it's important to review your bank statements and not delegate that to an employee. This is a little bit off topic, but over the years, I've really seen a lot of heartbreaking internal embezzlement situations too. It does happen. And it's always somebody that the business owner has come to really trust and rely on. And, you know, they just let that person handle the bank accounts and the finance. And before they know it, they wake up and find out that a lot of money has gone out the door. So it is important to, you know, if it's a family business, husband and wife, for instance, you know, that's one thing. But if you've got an employee, even a trusted employee who's handling the books and doing the account reconciliations, it's important for the owner to actually review those bank statements. And one thing that I think is still more common in businesses, but a lot of people, individuals, got out of the habit of doing account reconciliation every month to make sure that, you know, they balance their checkbook. I think businesses are still a lot better at that than individuals are, but going through and doing that reconciliation every month is another good way to make sure that your account is like it's supposed to be. We talked about the Positive Pay. We talked about ACH network, how that works. By the way, another feature of ACH is that you can actually use it to collect money. So if you've got, especially if you're collecting recurring monthly amounts, like a self-storage or a fitness club or something like that, that collects a certain amount from their customers every month, you can set that up through the same platform that you use for paying vendors or doing payroll. You can set those, we call them ACH debits. I have to think about this. A credit is when you're pushing money out. A debit is when that money is coming in. But you can set those up. There you go. Ampay. Okay, there we go. We got you muted. Okay, so that covers check fraud. Next one I want to go over is corporate account takeover. But before we leave check fraud, does anybody have any questions or anything that would be helpful to talk about before we move on to the next topic?
Hey, Greg.
Yes.
How secure are your checking and savings accounts these days with all the electronics that are out there, the electronic banking, what have you? Are they relatively secure?
So that's kind of where we're going next is with the electronic side of this. The check side is really kind of more the paper part of it.
Okay,
and honestly, most of what we see is check fraud and not having your online accounts or not having electronic access to the accounts happening, which is good because to me, losing control of your accounts is much scarier than somebody presenting a fraudulent check on your account. But the networks themselves are very secure. What tends to not be secure is the confidential information. And we're going to talk a lot about that here in just a second. But good question, Charlie.
Thank you.
Any other questions on check fraud before we move on? Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is corporate account takeover. And what do I mean by account takeover? Basically, that's when a fraudster gains access to... I'm sorry, I'm going to pause, see if we can mute Ampy Patino again. There we go. Okay. So what do we mean by corporate account takeover? That's when somebody gains access to your accounts online and is able to gain control of those accounts. And that can be a scary thing. And as I said, we don't see as much of that, but once someone gains online access to your account, they can usually do things like originate wire transfers. They can originate these ACH accounts. They can basically transfer or take your money electronically. And to me, that's a lot more scary situation. And typically the way that they're able to do that is by gaining access to your confidential, sensitive information. So not just your account number, like we talked about with the checks, but they actually get social security number, address, phone number, date of birth, all the typical things that banks use to confirm our customer's identity when they call up on the phone. Unfortunately, when people are online or when they get hacked, that sensitive confidential information becomes compromised and it gets into the hands of the wrong people, and then they can begin to go in and access your accounts electronically and do nefarious things. Trying to change slides and it's not letting me. Yeah. Here we go. Okay. So what can you do? So the first thing we're going to talk about is just educating your employees. So sometimes your information can be compromised by somebody getting in and gaining access to your computer system, your computer network at work. That can be done through malware. It can be done by employees clicking on an email that is loaded with malware. And so then they get access into your network that way. And so training employees on how to operate online safely and help protect the company information is really important. And, really, we think about securing your cash and other valuables in a physical sense, but really the cyber environment is a much more important thing to protect, because people get a hold of your identity and they've got access to pretty much everything at that point. So just being and we'll talk about some things that you can do, but the obvious things would be, use secure passwords, keep your software updated, your virus protection in place and up to date, and don't use your don't use your anniversary or your wife's birthday or your kid's name as your password. Use something that's complex and harder to access. And then talk to your bank. And this is probably a good place for me to just put in a plug for, if you don't know your bank or your banker, that's a really, really important thing, because we've had instances of attempted fraud that were sniffed out just because we recognized our customer's voice on the phone. And somebody was calling in posing as our customer. And because we knew them and recognized their voice, we were able to determine that this was an attempted fraud. They were trying to get access to their account, and that was snuffed out. So having a relationship with your banker and a partnership is really, really important, especially for businesses. And there's just any number of ways that, bankers really want to be able to be your partner. They want to be able to help you grow, whether that's loans or whether that's getting, the positive pay set up or helping you get set up to do electronic vendor payments or whatever it is. Taking the time to sit down, get to know your banker, have them get to know your business, and expressing to them, your concerns about keeping your money safe and just getting input from your banker can be a really important thing to do. Also, when I was talking about ACH payments, there's also ways that they can set up limits on how much can go out in a given day. So you can set up, okay, I want to be able to send payments to vendors, but I don't want more than, let's say, $5,000 a day to go out. And so you can set limits. So if somebody were to hack you, they couldn't send out more than what the limit is pre-approved for. We talked about reviewing bank statements, but really, just watching, being vigilant, looking for fraud, looking for phishing attempts. We talked about educating your employees, but make sure they understand what a suspicious email looks like. Most of these suspicious emails are not really that well done. So a lot of times they'll have typos in them, or they just don't make sense. It's you've won $1 million, or it's just not a credible email. But sometimes we get busy, or we're checking our emails on our phone, and we're just not as diligent about reviewing those. And we click on a link, and before you know it, we've got malware on our computer network. So make sure that you're being vigilant against that. If something looks bad, call your bank and say, hey, it looks like our network might have been compromised. we want to go ahead and put a hold on our account, or put it in limited status. We're basically reviewing that account to make sure that anything that is attempting to be cleared is a legitimate item. So we can do that if we feel like the system has been compromised. And then just understand, a lot of times with these frauds, fortunately, the bank will reimburse, especially on these fraudulent checks. If we pay a fraudulent check on an account, and it's something that, we should have caught, or that, your account wasn't, you didn't, do something wrong, then you can get reimbursed for that from the bank, even if the fraudster got away with it. But just understand what those account agreements say, what you need to do to be able to report those kinds of things. So as you're either opening accounts or opening some of these other services like Positive Pay or whatever, understand what exactly your responsibilities are and what to do if you suspect that something has been compromised. I wanted to give some additional resources here. So the U.S. Chamber has some good information on their website. The FCC has information, Better Business Bureau, the National Automated Clearinghouse Association, or NACHA, has information on electronic payments and how to keep yourself safe from account takeover. One of the things that we see most frequently in the bank is somehow a fraudster gets something more than just your account number and your bank account number. They get your social security number, they get your address, they get your date of birth. And once they get that information, then they're off to the races trying to get the bank to change your email address, change your phone number, so that they can call in or begin to communicate with the bank and say, hey, I got locked out of my online banking. I need my password reset. Password gets reset, and now they've got control of your account. So we're asking for a whole lot more information to verify customers. So in some cases, that might mean going back and tell me, give me the last 3 checks that you wrote. Tell me some information about yourself that wouldn't be otherwise available to a fraudster, to try to really make sure, if we don't know the customer, and again, the best way is we just know who you are. We know the sound of your voice. We've been dealing with you forever. And so it's easy to tell that this is legit. You get into some of the bigger communities or some of the bigger banks where they don't know the customers as well, and it's a little bit harder to verify who exactly is your customer and who's not, especially when they're not sitting across the desk from you. So, but they'll get access to that. A lot of times that will be because your home computer gets hacked. A lot of times, and I see this a lot and try to educate people as we go, but most email correspondence is not secure. So if you send an email to someone and it's not specifically encrypted, that email can be intercepted. And if you're sending information, excuse me. Let's say you're buying a house and you're wanting to get pre-qualified with a mortgage company, and you send your W-2 statements, or you send a pay stub, or you send a tax return with your social security number to your mortgage lender. You don't send that encrypted. That can be intercepted, and all of a sudden a fraudster now has access to your social security number. So anytime you've got any personal or sensitive confidential information like your social security number, even your bank account number, get it encrypted. Learn how to send and originate an encrypted email. If you're sending information to your banker, typically what we do is anytime we're requesting confidential information, if we're working on a loan or a mortgage, we'll send an encrypted email, and our customers can reply back to that with attachments, and that when they send it back, it will come back through encrypted. But never send any account information, account numbers, social security numbers, anything like that through an unsecured, non-encrypted email. Also, text messages are generally not safe either. So I've had my kids try to text me passwords for certain things, and that's not a good way to do that. So just be sensitive of that. Most of the time, we really don't know how the sensitive confidential information gets compromised, gets into the hands of the fraudsters, but there's any number of different ways to do that. And so we just have to be so cautious about everything from unencrypted emails to the passwords on our home computer network, just any of those kinds of things, clicking on emails. Just have to be so vigilant, because it just takes one little mistake and all of a sudden your information is compromised. So finally, I think I've hit on some of these, but just kind of in some closing thoughts. Another scam we hear about a lot is getting a phone number from someone who claims to be from your bank, and they need your PIN number, or they need your password in order to, do something to get your online banking working again or something like that. Banks will never call you up out of the blue and ask you for information that they already have. That's a scammer at work, and we need to be on the watch for that. Use strong passwords. Don't send sensitive or confidential information via unsecured text or emails. Keep your software and virus protection up to date. Don't click on phony emails. And another thing that I haven't talked about, and this is worth emphasizing. So there's something called two-factor authentication, and you guys may not be familiar with that term, but I'm sure you've seen it, you've used it. So if you're going online to try to access, let's say, your online 401k statement or your brokerage statement or your bank account, you go in, you put your password in, put your username and password, but then before it shows you your information, it asks you to enter into a unique 5-digit code that they're going to text you or email to you. So that's that second code that you have to enter. That's the two-factor authentication. And so if a bad actor gets a hold of your password and username, for instance, if you've got your two-factor authentication enabled, they still won't be able to access if you've still got control of your phone, because that code will be text or emailed to your phone or your email, and hopefully the fraudster doesn't have access to that. So I know it's a pain. I personally don't like having to do that, but that's kind of a last line of defense. If somebody's got online access to your accounts, go ahead and click on enable that two-factor authentication. Go through that extra step. It only takes a few seconds, but it really is protecting you in the event that your password is compromised. All right. Well, that's kind of the end of the information I had prepared, but I'm happy to address any questions that anybody has out there. Again, caveat, I'm not a cybersecurity expert or a fraud expert, but I'm happy to try to address any questions that you have. All right.
Well, and I'll say something that happened to us recently, and thanks, Greg, for presenting this, that somebody somehow had spoofed my email here at the chamber. And so Lacey over at Happy called and said, hey, you haven't responded to my emails about switching over access to your account. I'm like, well, I didn't send anything. Somehow somebody had gotten in and anything Happy was sending to me was getting intercepted. And when I tried to send something to Happy, they were intercepting it. So we had to get with our IT at Documation. We had to go in, clear some stuff out on our end, reset my password. But basically what they had tried to do is get Happy to add our new accountant, which we didn't have, to do online transactions. So again, like Greg said, making sure your banker knows you and you know your banker, that really saved us, because had that gone through, they could have wiped out everything we had at the chamber. So just what Greg said is very true. Know your banker. Well, like I say, we will post this link. So anybody, if you want to share it with other people, that should be in our newsletter that goes out next week, because it's really good content. So we encourage people to share it or go to any of our content on our YouTube page and check that out. But thank you guys so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks for putting this on.